Before Edward and I got engaged, he had a car accident and lost his memory. He thought the one he was going to marry was his first love, the woman who had abandoned him before. Everyone explained to him, but he stubbornly insisted on canceling the wedding with me. Secretly, I breathed a sigh of relief. After all, even before this, I had already wanted to break up. Chapter 1. I learned about Edward's accident on the very day of our engagement. While I was still wondering whether I should notify relatives and friends to attend the engagement banquet, I received a call from Edward's assistant. He had been in a car accident and lost his memory. When I rushed to the hospital ward, Edward had already woken up. Cristiana was sitting by his bedside, her eyes red from crying. Edward, with a helpless kind of tenderness, wiped away her tears. Then he heard movement at the door, turned around, and saw me. The softness in his eyes instantly vanished, replaced only by wariness. Cristiana quickly stood up, flustered, and explained to me, "Chloe, there's nothing between Edward and me. Since you're here, I'll leave right away." She made to go, but Edward firmly held her hand. When he turned his gaze on me, his eyes were filled with nothing but coldness and estrangement. Of course, in the memory of 20-year-old Edward, Chloe was almost a forgotten figure. His voice was detached and distant. "To be honest, Chloe, I don't know why the person with me now has become you, but in my heart, Cristiana is the one I love." Cristiana's tears fell like raindrops. I stood in the ward, watching the two of them, and thought how ridiculous this scene was. I was supposed to be Edward's fiancée, yet I had inexplicably become the outsider in their story. Edward said coldly, "Cristiana, stay." A polite way of asking me to leave. His assistant Leo walked in and, seeing this scene, looked a little awkward. I watched them quietly for a moment, then turned and walked out of the ward. Leo explained, "President Edward's amnesia is only temporary. The doctor said that after some time and with surgery, he will recover. Miss, please don't worry." I nodded. "Since he doesn't welcome me right now, you stay and keep an eye on him. If anything unusual happens, let me know immediately." When I stepped out of the ward, the sky was still heavy and dark, the sign of an approaching storm. The night before, the weather had been just like this. Edward and I had been carefully going over every detail of the engagement banquet. His eyes and brows had been full of joy. Then he answered a phone call from Cristiana. She sounded anxious, telling him her car had rear-ended someone on the highway. She was scared and didn't know what to do. The smile slowly faded from Edward's face. I held his hand and told him she can call the traffic police. Or I can help her find someone. It's going to rain soon. It'll be dangerous. Edward hesitated for a moment, then just as he had many times in the past, let go of my hand. Putting on his coat, he said, "Cristiana just returned to the country. She's unfamiliar with everything here. I'll help her just this once. It won't be a big deal." By the time he left, the rain had already started. The weather forecast had warned of heavy storms that night. But Edward still went without hesitation, and then he had the accident. Chapter 2. After leaving the hospital, I received a phone call. It was from Edward's number, but the caller was Cristiana. Cristiana said, "Chloe, I truly feel sorry. I never intended to cause trouble for you too. With things turning out like this, I feel guilty too." Listening to her voice, I slowly replied, "You should feel guilty." Cristiana was clearly stunned. On the other end, she took a deep breath. "Don't worry, I'll give Edward back to you. But right now, in his memory, there's only me. He only wants me by his side. Could you, for the time being, not show up?" I put down the contract I was reviewing, walked over to the window, and waited for her to say something even more shameless. "He said he only wants to stay with me. After he's discharged, I want to take him back to my place. Maybe it will help his memory recover." In the calm standoff, I let out a soft laugh. "Fine. If you want him, then take him." To be honest, Cristiana and I never really had any personal grudges. I always knew she was Edward's first love. I once thought of her as a rival, but in reality, that was the first time she had ever seen me. The first time Cristiana's name appeared in my world was when I learned she was dating Edward. At that time, I was in my sophomore year of college, working part-time jobs every day to support myself, often returning late to the dorm, so I didn't know much about the latest campus gossip. Until my roommate mentioned that the beautiful host of the school's big events, Cristiana, was already taken. Her boyfriend was Edward, the handsome guy from the finance department. In that instant, I felt powerless and frozen to the bone. I liked Edward. I had liked him for a very, very long time. It was my secret alone. Looking back now, I can't even recall exactly how I felt at that moment. I only remember that back then we still had the campus running challenge. I opened the running app on my phone, went to the track, and ran lap after lap. By the end, I collapsed on the ground. The app showed I had run 6 kilometers. I thought about many things. I understood that the gap between Edward and me was an insurmountable chasm. I needed part-time jobs and student loans just to get through college, while Edward's family, afraid he wouldn't live comfortably, had already bought him a spacious apartment near the campus. Even if I worked hard for a lifetime, I might never be able to afford a place like that. There was a student exchange program to the United States, and with my high GPA, my counselor recommended me. She told me earnestly that I was a hard-working student, but if my effort was only spent on physical part-time jobs instead of exploring the broader world, then for my future, all that hard work would be wasted. I understood what she meant, and I was tempted, but I hesitated for a long time. In the end, I declined. The reason was simple. I didn't have money. Although tuition and airfare were covered, the living expenses abroad were something I simply could not afford. Back then, I was that poor. But the day after I learned Edward was in a relationship, I went to my counselor and took that exchange opportunity. In my heart, it wasn't resignation, it was defiance. I was born poor, but I didn't want to spend my life only able to look up at him from afar. After securing the exchange spot, I worked even harder. I still remember the night before I left the country. I was still working a part-time job. When I returned to campus from outside, I passed by the gymnasium and saw a huge, beautiful bouquet of flowers. As I walked closer, I realized the one holding them was Edward. He was still as handsome as ever, tall and upright, smiling as he waited for his girlfriend, Cristiana, who was hosting the event. Dressed in a floor-length gown, she walked out slowly with exquisite makeup on. Amid the cheers and teasing of the crowd, she smiled radiantly as she accepted the flowers from Edward's hands. Fireworks lit up the sky. The crowd laughed, lively and joyous. Youth was dazzling like that. I averted my eyes and calmly brushed past them. The next day, I went abroad. But when I came back, the once passionate couple had already broken up. It was Cristiana who ended it. She had fallen in love with someone else, and so they parted ways. Time has passed, things have changed, and I am no longer that poor student who could only hide in the corner, secretly envying others. Edward and I started a company together, and I became his business partner. Now I am the glamorous president, admired by many. During Edward's hospitalization, I held the company together, keeping everything steady. But there are some matters that truly require Edward. An overseas acquisition deal was approaching its final stage, and Edward's signature was necessary. He didn't have to show up in person, but his signature was indispensable. Leo said he had called Edward many times, but none of the calls went through. I understood immediately and drove to Cristiana's address. Strictly speaking, I should not have known her exact home address down to the house number. But one time, after she returned to the country in the middle of the night, she had a high fever and called Edward, sending him her address while feverish. When Edward came back, he was afraid I might misunderstand, so he honestly showed me their chat history. Aside from a few times when Cristiana sought his help, there was nothing ambiguous. He reassured me, and at that time, I was indeed reassured. I have an excellent memory. Just once was enough for me to remember exactly where Cristiana lived. Now my car was parked downstairs at Cristiana's place. I sat inside, not in a hurry to go up. While taking a smoke break, I saw Cristiana walking out with Edward, her arm linked through his. They were talking and laughing, acting so intimately, just like a couple in love, with no difference at all. They walked into a nearby mall, and I followed in my car, neither too fast nor too slow. I parked and trailed them inside, watching as the two of them went to ride go-karts. Edward looked genuinely happy. Through all these years of building the company together, his temperament had grown steadier and more restrained, and his smiles had become rarer. To be honest, it had been a long time since I'd seen him laugh so freely. That smile was dazzling, almost blinding, and so I slowly drew closer, close enough for them to finally notice me. The smile faded from Edward's face, and he came to a stop. My gaze fell to his hand gripping the steering wheel. On his left middle finger, the simple ring was gone. I lowered my eyes to my own left hand. There I was, still wearing the ring that once matched Edward's. The three of us sat down in a cafe on the first floor. To keep things short, I briefly explained to Edward the current predicament, that we needed his signature, but he hadn't been answering his phone. Cristiana quickly jumped in to explain. Edward's phone got water damaged yesterday while he was showering, so it's being repaired. Her face flushed red. I gave her a cold glance with no desire to ask further questions. Looking directly at Edward, I said, I don't need your excuses. What you need to do right now is return to the company and sign the contract. Edward clearly didn't believe me, his gaze suspicious. I had no intention of explaining more, so I directly called Leo and let him explain the matter to Edward himself. Edward took the phone and walked outside to answer the call, leaving just me and Cristiana at the corner table. The Cristiana in front of me no longer looked timid as she had a few days ago. Perhaps being cherished by Edward these past days had given her confidence. She came straight out with it. Chloe, the person Edward loves now is me. I stirred my coffee casually, my tone indifferent. So what? Cristiana spoke with solemnity. I regret it. All these years I've regretted abandoning Edward back then. I was too young, too easily deceived by temptation, but once I realized it was too late to turn back. So, Chloe, I want to say this to you. Please give up on Edward. Give him back to me. After all, clinging to a man who doesn't love you is also a kind of suffering. I raised my head and saw Edward outside the cafe, still on the phone with Leo. His brows were tightly furrowed. By chance, he met my gaze, then quickly looked away. Not long ago, he used to kiss my forehead every morning when we woke, whispering good morning. The human heart changes easily. Looking at Cristiana, who was anxiously awaiting an answer, I asked in a detached tone, then what are the terms? Cristiana froze for a moment. Patiently, I spelled it out for her. Everything in this world has a price. How much is Edward worth to you? How much are you willing to pay? And another thing, Miss Cristiana, Edward and I have worked side by side for 7 years. Half the company's success is my effort. Now that the time has come to reap the fruits, you brazenly step in. What exactly do you think this is? After years of fighting in the business world, I was no longer that silent, meek girl. Cristiana's eyes turned red under my questioning. Almost embarrassed, she fumbled through her bag and pulled out several cards, saying, I have money. I can give you everything I have. I also own a few properties. Aside from the one I live in, I can give you the others too. Her laughably naive words and actions nearly amused me. Miss Cristiana, what would I want with any of that? Do you think I don't already have those things? Bewilderment slowly crossed her eyes. Then what do you want, Chloe? Outside, Edward had finished his call and was heading toward us. Shares. Half of the company shares in Edward's hands. The cafe door opened just then, and I was certain Edward had heard my words. His expression darkened, and his gaze fell on me with a complicated look. A few seconds later, a hint of scorn flashed in his eyes. Curling his lips, he sneered softly, Chloe, you really know how to take advantage of a crisis. I picked up my bag, stood, and curved my lips at the two of them. Yes, I'm exactly that kind of woman now. The kind who only sees money. I've named my terms. Whether you accept or not, that's up to you. Chapter 5. The Edward who had returned to his 20-year-old self did not disappoint me. At that age, in Edward's heart, love was more important than career. He was willing to give up half of his shares for Cristiana, and from then on, I became the largest shareholder in the company. When I received this news, my feelings were complicated. Leo, the assistant, thought I was sad because of Edward's determination to break up. He handed me a cup of hot tea to comfort me. President Edward just can't remember you right now. Once he does, everything will get better. He misunderstood. In truth, I wasn't all that heartbroken. We both knew that once the equity transfer agreement was signed, Edward and I were finished for life. So, on the day Edward came to the company to sign the agreement, Leo still couldn't help advising him, "President Edward, are you really sure about this? Over the years, you and President Chloe have built this company step by step, side by side. The bond forged in hardship is unlike any other, and you two were originally going to get married. I'm afraid that when your memory returns, you'll regret this." Edward's hand paused only briefly as he flipped through the agreement. He lifted those heavy eyes to glance at me, then withdrew his gaze and said firmly, "I won't." Edward signed his name without hesitation. To him, trading half his shares for freedom with Cristiana was a profitable deal. I stared at the agreement and let out a small laugh. Before the smile had fully bloomed, Edward's voice reached my ears. His expression, rare in recent days, was serious and complex. Looking straight at me, he said quietly, "These days I've listened to our story. Chloe, I'm grateful for your companionship and support all these years. I've thought it through carefully. I realize the love I thought I had for you was actually more a sense of gratitude, moved by the feelings we shared in hardship." Leo's face darkened, and he rushed to defend me. "President Edward, your care for Chloe has been plain to see. It was never just gratitude." I patted Leo's shoulder, signaling him to stay silent. The secretary entered to report that Cristiana had been waiting for Edward for quite some time. Edward's expression suddenly turned tense. I called his name, and his steps halted. I smiled at him and said, "I hope you won't regret this in the future." His expression shifted to one of cold determination, his eyes firm and unyielding. In the silence, Leo looked at me with a trace of sympathy. I raised the agreement in my hand, smiling as I said, "I've struck a great deal." No one knew that when Cristiana asked me to step aside, deep down I felt relieved. The truth was, I had wanted to break up for a long time. Even to this day, I can honestly admit, I liked Edward. I liked him for many years. Edward had witnessed me at my most miserable, 17. Back then, I was withdrawn and silent, seen by classmates as an unsociable top student. I didn't dare go to the cafeteria with them because I was afraid they would notice that every time I only bought the simplest vegetable dish with rice, or sometimes just rice alone. I didn't dare go shopping with my roommates either because I couldn't afford a single thing in the stores. At that time, I calculated every penny carefully. My daily expenses and study materials had to be scraped together bit by bit. Yet even with such caution and thrift, I still could not resist the fate that seemed inevitable. My mother had passed away early, and I lived with my father. But after he remarried and had a new family, he barely cared about me. Even the 50 yuan allowance he promised each week was often delayed. One thing he always said was, "What's the use of a girl studying so much? She'll get married sooner or later." And sure enough, when I was in my second year of high school, he said my younger brother needed money for an elite private kindergarten, and he came to school to force me to drop out. My homeroom teacher tried hard to persuade him otherwise, saying I had excellent grades, that I could get into a prestigious 985 university, and that I could better help my family in the future. But my father wouldn't listen. He stubbornly insisted on my withdrawal. Standing in the teacher's office, I felt the pitying gazes of many teachers. I kept my head down, staring at the worn-out shoes on my feet. I lowered my head to hide the tears of humiliation that I refused to let others see. The teacher refused to sign off, and my father, furious, grabbed me by the uniform, trying to drag me out of school by force. Students from other classes began peeking in, and I heard their whispers. Perhaps they meant no harm, but those glances and murmurs were enough to crush the fragile pride I had tried so hard to hide. If there had been a hole in the ground at that moment, I would have crawled into it without hesitation, never to come out again. That was when Edward appeared. He was from the neighboring class. Because of his good looks, excellent grades, and privileged family background, he was well known at school. He came into the office to deliver homework, witnessed the scene, and quickly understood the situation. Standing in front of my father, the teenage boy, taller than my father, pressed his lips together and said nothing, yet radiated a suffocating sense of pressure. My father made a fuss, but with the teachers and students blocking him, he eventually let go. Later, Edward went into the office. I don't know what he said to the teachers, but that afternoon he brought me a brand new school uniform. I had very few clothes, so I often wore the school-issued uniforms even at home. They had turned pale and frayed at the edges, but I had no choice except to keep wearing them. Edward said nothing. In fact, aside from that day, we had never spoken a word to each other. Not long after, however, an aunt came to sponsor me. She met me at school, kind and gentle, and when she left, she secretly slipped me a red envelope. It wasn't until later that I found out. That was Edward's mother. She patted my head and said, "My son told me you're an exceptionally good student. He sees you as his competitor, so you must keep working hard too." I had always thought of myself as strong, rarely shedding tears. But that day, when I received the envelope, I felt overwhelmingly sad. So very sad. It's easy to remember someone. From the age of 17, I began to notice Edward, to like Edward. He became the untouchable white moonlight in my heart, the distant dream I longed for. I yearned to get closer to him, and I longed for the day when I could meet him calmly with dignity. Chapter 7. The next time I heard from Edward was a month later when his mother, Aunt Law, came to find me, hoping to have a talk. I could refuse others, but I could never refuse Aunt Law. She truly was a good person. She had sponsored me through high school and even wanted to continue supporting me through college. But back then, out of pride and the fear of owing too much, I firmly refused. Aunt Law still had the same gentle expression as always when she said to me, "Edward's memory has returned." She explained that before, Cristiana had been afraid that once Edward regained his memory, he would no longer love her, so she begged him not to undergo surgery, and Edward agreed. But his parents disagreed. After all, what he had lost wasn't only his memory of me but also the 10 years of experience and ability he had accumulated. Now, after the surgery, everything was restored to how it had been. After a brief silence, I simply smiled. That's good. He can come back to work now. The company really does need him. Aunt Law sighed, speaking with heartfelt earnestness. Chloe, you know what I mean. Edward and Cristiana's relationship was nearly 10 years ago. His memory loss may have troubled you, but I can see things clearly. His heart now belongs only to you. As soon as he recovered, he moved out right away. These days, he's shut himself up in his room. I can tell. He wants to see you, but he doesn't dare. He's afraid to face you. Her tone carried a trace of regret. I didn't want to offend her, but given how things had developed, I couldn't help but ask, Aunt Law, tell me, if love is out of 100, how many points would Edward's love be worth? Aunt Law was stunned. When people are in love, it's hard not to compare themselves to a lover's ex. Though I had once tried to ignore Edward's past with Cristiana during his days of amnesia, I couldn't stop myself from comparing how he was with me versus with Cristiana. When was his love more passionate? I didn't really want the answer, but deep down, I couldn't help but feel sad. When Aunt Law didn't answer for a long time, I smiled faintly and gave my own score. In my heart, Edward's love is worth 60 points. He was a qualified lover, but nothing more than that. But Aunt Law, am I only worth a love of 60 points? Hearing my counter-question, the gentle face across from me finally revealed a trace of embarrassment. If it had been the Chloe of the past, simply being with Edward would have felt like happiness. She wouldn't have cared how much he loved her nor how many points his love was worth. Because for a Chloe who had never received true love, even the smallest bit of love would have been enough to satisfy her. Unfortunately, the Edward now faced a 30-year-old Chloe. I used to believe that I had to be excellent enough, hardworking enough, to be worthy of Edward, to deserve his love. Back then, I couldn't see myself at all. My eyes and heart held only Edward. But in the process of chasing Edward, I gained so many other things. Gradually, I came to see the self who had once gone unseen. And I realized that more than Edward, I liked the version of myself who was striving hard to catch up to him. After a long while, Aunt Law murmured with a hint of melancholy, Chloe, you've given so much for Edward. Chapter 8. Now speaking of those sacrifices, they no longer hold much meaning. After all, at the time I accepted them willingly. After finishing the exchange program, I turned down offers from other, more powerful companies. With my strong resume, I joined Edward's family's company. I knew Edward worked there, so I applied for a position in the investment department. I longed to be closer to him. Since Edward was destined to take a place in the family's management someday, my goal back then was to reach a middle management position within 3 years so that he would no longer be able to ignore me. I wanted him to see me at my best. On my very first day at the company, I was nervous. I wondered if Edward would recognize me, and if he did, how I should greet him. But unfortunately, when Edward saw me, he didn't remember who I was. He only gave me a cold nod. Clearly, he didn't recall the schoolmate he had once helped back in high school. What surprised me even more was that after a year of working there, Edward suddenly had a heated falling out with his parents. One day, he abruptly left the company. At the time, I was on the verge of being promoted to the role of assistant manager. Yet without hesitation, I handed in my resignation and decisively threw myself into Edward's startup. Call it foolish love if you will, but back then, Edward was my sole motivation to keep climbing upward. When Edward saw my resume, his gaze paused for several seconds. Then he looked up, his deep eyes fixed on me. Chloe. A slow smile rose in his eyes. I remember you. He had finally recalled the poor student he had once helped back in high school. At that time, Edward was strapped for cash and only had a tiny office. I invested my savings and joined him. That year was harsh. We often worked overtime until midnight. Once, after I had already gone home, I suddenly remembered a set of data and urgently wanted the answer. So I rushed back to the office without stopping. To my surprise, Edward was still there. He looked particularly startled to see me. I pulled out a report and waved him over. He stayed quiet for a rare moment, then said, "It's too late. I'll take you home." Later, the company gradually found its footing, hired more employees, and soon faced its Series A financing. At heart, I was still a quiet engineering student. Often when I bumped into Edward at the office, we simply exchanged brief greetings. Outside of work, we barely shared anything personal. But social dinners with investors were unavoidable. One night, Edward drank far too much and couldn't continue. I knew how important those people were to the company, so I forced myself to endure, racking my brain to say polite words I had never spoken before and downing glass after glass of alcohol. Afterward, when we both ended up sick, Edward stared at me and in a tone of certainty asked, "Chloe, do you like me?" With the honesty of drunkenness, I laughed openly. "Yes, you finally noticed." Even after confessing my feelings, my relationship with Edward didn't make any real progress. It was only that at later dinners, Edward would shield me from one drink after another. In fact, after that very first business dinner, I no longer felt resistance toward them. I became more and more skilled at speaking, at pretending. My tolerance for alcohol also grew stronger and stronger. Sometimes when I looked in the mirror, I wondered how I had changed so much. But then when I turned my head and saw Edward, I thought, at least one thing hadn't changed, my liking for him. In the 4th year of the company, after a celebration banquet, I hadn't drunk much, but Edward was a little drunk. On the way home, he suddenly grabbed my hand, looked intently into my eyes, and said, "Let's be together." We were sitting in the back seat then, under dim lights. I knew he was drunk, so I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I asked him, "Do you know who I am?" His burning cheek pressed against my palm and with a tipsy smile, he said, "Of course, you're Chloe." At that moment, I felt a surreal wave wash over me. Afraid it was just a passing impulse, I held his face in my trembling hands and asked, "Edward, be clear. Why do you want to be with me? Because we fit? Because you're moved? Or because you like me?" Edward kissed my palm and said, "Because of love, Chloe. Because I love you." I lowered my head, tears spilling uncontrollably. After that, we were together. At first, I did doubt Edward's love. I wasn't sure if he truly loved me, or perhaps deep down I believed Edward couldn't love me, that no one could ever love me. But Edward truly was a wonderful partner. Tolerant, thoughtful, I couldn't find fault with him. Once, when I didn't show up at the company in the morning because of an acute appendicitis attack, Edward immediately sensed something was wrong, because I was never late. He dropped an important meeting on the spot, rushed into my home, and carried me to the hospital, so frantic that he lost one of his shoes along the way. When he held me in his arms, his hands were trembling. I think that was the day I most firmly believed in Edward's love. Later, we moved in together. Back then, what I felt was genuine happiness. Chapter 10. A few days after Aunt Law left, I saw Edward at the company again after a long absence. He had lost a lot of weight. The suits that used to fit him so well now hung loosely on his frame. A shadow of stubble darkened his face, and he looked worn out and dispirited. He sat in silence at the company, and when he saw me, his voice was hoarse. "Chloe, let's talk." I nodded and motioned for him to step into my office. The first thing Edward said after sitting down was, "Chloe, I never thought about marrying anyone else." I just stared at him, watching his eyes gradually redden, his voice catching in his throat. He said, "I'm sorry for everything during this time. I don't know how to express my apology. What I want you to know is, from beginning to end, I only ever wanted to marry you." I had no doubt that Edward's words in that moment were sincere. But now that his memory had returned, and with it his love for me, was I supposed to accept him again without hesitation? Edward's finger once more wore the ring we had chosen together. For some reason, I suddenly wanted to laugh. So I stretched out my left hand, showing him my bare finger. "Edward, it's really over between us." It was as if he collapsed all at once. He just stared blankly at my hand, eyes bloodshot, his breath rasping painfully in his throat. The truth was, the ring Edward had first used to propose to me was not this simple one. Half a year ago, one evening after returning from an auction, we both happened to have time. We were lying on the sofa, watching a boring TV drama. Edward suddenly pulled out a pink diamond he had won at the auction and slid it onto my finger. Under my confused gaze, he said very seriously, "Chloe, let's get married." Even then, just as now, I wasn't sure whether it was a sudden impulse or a carefully considered decision. After all, at that time, I had just learned the reason he left his family company years ago, to fund Cristiana's little for-fun startup. His parents had found out and scolded him for being reckless. We had been in a cold war over that very matter. I couldn't tell if his proposal came from guilt as a way to reconcile or from a genuine wish to enter marriage with me. But back then, for me, being able to marry Edward was the ultimate dream come true. So I chose not to question it. I nodded and accepted his proposal. In our relationship, he was always the one in the higher position. As long as he wanted marriage, I would always agree. And if he never brought it up, I was still willing to continue dating him forever. Later, I complained the diamond was too big, that no one proposed with such an oversized ring. I urged him to pick out a pair of simple bands with me instead. While choosing, he suddenly told the clerk he wanted our initials engraved inside the rings. I laughed at him for being tacky, but he only smiled and patted my head. Through these years, we had both distance and closeness. Sometimes I felt we were in love, and sometimes I wondered, was it always just me alone in this love I still don't understand? Chapter 11. After a long silence, Edward asked me in a hoarse voice, "Chloe, can you give me one more chance?" Under his hopeful gaze, I gently shook my head. We were adults. Whatever Edward and Cristiana had done during his amnesia, I didn't want to dig into it for the sake of pride, but we both knew the truth. Afraid he might persist, I decided to be honest with him. "Edward, actually I already had thoughts of breaking up before the engagement." He was visibly shocked, his brows furrowing slightly as if he couldn't comprehend. I slowly recalled the things that had happened during that time. Cristiana returned 3 months ago, and she always found various reasons to ask for your help. Sometimes while we were eating dinner, she'd say her pipes broke, and you'd rush over. On our 3rd anniversary, I was just opening your gift when she said she was lost, and again, you went to her. Ever since she came back, all kinds of accidents happened, each time requiring your urgent help. At first, I was just upset. I told you she's 30 years old now, Not some helpless girl who needs her ex-boyfriend from 10 years ago to solve everything. But do you remember what you told me? You said Cristiana had just returned, that things in the country had developed too fast and she wasn't used to anything yet. You told me to understand. At this, I gave a mocking little laugh. Tell me, Edward, did Cristiana suddenly lose her most basic ability to live as soon as she came back? Did she really have no friends or family here? Why did she have to come to you? And why did you have to say yes every time? Faced with my relentless questioning, the man across from me was struck speechless. After a long time, he muttered, "I'm sorry." I couldn't help but laugh derisively. I didn't need his meaningless apologies or repentance. I continued, "At first, I could endure it. After all, I had liked you for so long. We were about to get married. What was a little tolerance? But later I thought, why should I endure it? Was it because I loved you more or because I couldn't accept the sunk cost? I had treated marrying Edward as my life's ultimate goal, and so I held on too tightly. But looking back, why did it have to be marriage in order to be considered complete? The truth is, I hate being treated as a choice. Yet, Edward, time and again you put me and Cristiana side by side. And time and again you chose Cristiana. What made you think I would always be waiting for you? When did it begin? I wonder. When did the thought of breaking up first appear in me? Perhaps it was one of those late nights when Edward suddenly got a call from Cristiana. He jumped up in a hurry. I felt the bed spring back beside me, opened my eyes, and heard him whispering softly, nervously to reassure her. And in that moment, I thought, do I really want to marry the man lying next to me? I once chased after his footsteps, walked such a long road, and loved him for so many years. Now that a beautiful ending seemed so close, could I really just turn a blind eye? I was confused. I stayed confused for many days. Sometimes during meetings, when I looked at Edward's face, I suddenly wanted to talk to him. To say, Edward, let's break up. The truth was, I could no longer bear it. The thought of marrying him didn't bring me happiness but confusion. It felt as though I no longer liked him as much as before. But every time that thought appeared, another voice told me that the life goal I had once set for myself was about to be fulfilled. I should endure just a little longer. To end up with your true love. Wasn't that a fairy tale? A happiness worth clinging to, right? I was never someone who struggled with indecision. If I wanted something, I would do it. If I didn't, I would refuse decisively. But in this one matter, up until our engagement, I was still wavering, wondering whether I should break up with Edward. With him, I always lowered my bottom line again and again. During this time, I reflected on myself. When I was young, I always thought I wasn't good enough, not beautiful enough, while the Edward the First light shone so brightly. I believed I had to walk a long road, stumble through hardships, achieve worldly success before I could be worthy of standing by his side. It was as if the meaning of my life was to match Edward. I had been blinded by the filter of idolizing him, deliberately ignoring the things that, to the woman I am now, were unbearable. But filters always break one day. Now I even felt grateful for Edward's amnesia. At last, I no longer needed to hesitate. I could face my own heart with clarity. Looking back at 30, I was so accomplished, and the Edward the First once thought dazzling seemed nothing special after all. After a long silence, Edward gave a bitter smile. "Chloe, you've changed so much." I curved my lips into a standard smile, the kind I wore when negotiating business. Calmly, I said, "No one stays the same forever. I'm glad I've changed." After Edward left, I sat alone in my office for a long time. From 17 to 30, I had chased Edward for 13 years. To end it this way might not be perfect, but it didn't feel like regret either. Assistant Leo came in, placing a cup of hot coffee in front of me. There was pity in his eyes. After a moment, he couldn't help but say, "Miss Chloe, I think it's a little unfortunate." I looked at him and smiled faintly. "Are you pitying me?" Leo rushed to explain, but I waved my hand and said slowly, "For the years of time and love I've given, please don't pity me. I've fought so hard for so many years. If people still think I'm just a poor, pitiful woman, then I really have failed." Chapter 12. Edward and I parted on good terms. Our breakup involved neither arguments nor tearing each other apart. He never pursued the matter of the shares he had transferred while he was amnesiac. After his health recovered, he returned to work as usual. We often ran into each other at the company. He had grown more silent than before, and sometimes I would notice a deep gaze. When I turned my head, I would find it was Edward. I bore him no resentment. If anything, I still felt gratitude. I would always be thankful to the Edward who saved me in high school, that kind yet defiant boy who, in his own way, gave me a future full of possibilities. Though things between us had ended, I still maintained a good relationship with his family. If one day he or his family were in trouble, I would certainly lend a hand. But while I felt entirely at peace now, Edward seemed unable to get used to the calm, indifferent way we related to each other. 6 months later, he sold his shares to his parents' company, effectively stepping away from the business. I still had his contact information on my phone, but he rarely posted anything on his social feed. And since I had no interest in peeking into his private life, I didn't know where he had gone or what he was doing. What I didn't expect was that I would cross paths with Cristiana again. It happened 2 years later at a dinner party. By then, Cristiana was married to a small business owner in the supply chain industry. He came up to chat with me, and by coincidence, I saw Cristiana on his arm. Her face showed awkwardness. Perhaps she feared I would reveal her past to her husband or that I might sabotage his business out of old grudges. So, when I was momentarily alone, she gathered her courage to approach me. Taking a deep breath, she said solemnly, "I want to apologize for what happened back then." I looked at her quietly, saying nothing. Under my calm gaze, Cristiana seemed to feel a kind of pressure. She glanced at her husband in the distance, then lowered her voice. "Could I ask you not to target my husband's business because of me?" At the time, my career was at its peak. Many institutions wanted to take my company public, but I was in no hurry. I listened to Cristiana's words but simply kept staring at her. Under my gaze, she slowly lowered her head. "Do you really see me as someone so magnanimous?" I gave a cold laugh. "What makes you think I feel no resentment?" I had never planned to take revenge on Cristiana, nor did I truly hate her. Without her, I might have married Edward, but even then, I might never have truly seen myself. Yet, even though I had already forgotten her, she broke into my life again, demanding I turn a blind eye. To be honest, I wasn't so magnanimous. Under my merciless mockery, Cristiana left with her head lowered in embarrassment. In truth, I did not deliberately target her husband's company. But when his firm later bid for a project under one of my subsidiaries, I instructed my team to simply ignore him. Perhaps his bid was the most competitive among all, but this time I chose not to cooperate. He was eager to climb into my circle, but for the foreseeable future, I would never work with him. Simply because I had the power, and I happened not to like his wife. Sometimes I think fate is truly a strange thing. In the 5 years after breaking up with Edward, I never saw him again. I hadn't deliberately avoided him, but as his career flourished, news of him inevitably reached my ears. He opened an investment company in another city. It developed well, and one year he was even named an outstanding young entrepreneur. The next time I heard about him was 5 years later when I was dining with a few business friends. Everyone was drunk, and one of them brought up a new rising star in the financial news headlines, shaking his head with a laugh and saying that even he sometimes acted foolish. Just a week ago, we were drinking together. He stared at his phone for the longest time. I told him to put it down and drink, and then suddenly, out of nowhere, he asked, "Does Lapland have the northern lights right now?" The table erupted in laughter. I smiled politely as the man went on, still laughing. We all laughed at him. It was June. How could there be northern lights in June? He must have been drunk and muddle-headed. Don't you think his drinking tolerance is pathetic? Everyone laughed and began discussing the young, promising investor. My thoughts, however, drifted back to long ago. Back then, Edward and I were still doing well. I was lying on his lap while he dried my hair. The documentary channel was showing Lapland's aurora. A sudden impulse made me turn over and say to him, "Edward, let's go see the northern lights this year." He met my expectant eyes with a smile. All right. When we have time, we'll go. But then 1 year passed and another. The company was always busy. Edward and I were always busy. Somehow, there was never time for a trip. Never time to see the aurora. Never time to ride a reindeer sleigh. Last winter, I flew to Lapland alone. I hired a local guide and finally saw the aurora I had dreamed of. Standing in the ice and snow of Lapland, I realized, many sights don't need to be waited for. Last week, while scrolling through my phone album, I came across the photos I had taken. That night chasing the northern lights. A sudden wave of emotion made me post one online. Whether Edward liked it or not, I don't know. Too many people like my posts, every minute, every second, and I didn't care to scroll through to check. I wouldn't even recognize which profile picture belonged to Edward among the crowd. At the dinner table, my friends raised their glasses to toast a friend who had just divorced. The restaurant tonight had a perfect view. Sitting by the floor-to-ceiling window, I looked out at the dazzling city lights spread beneath my feet. 18 years ago, there was a girl here struggling. Over 50 yuan of living expenses. 18 years later, Chloe, at 35, had reached a place she had never imagined. I lifted my glass, smiling brightly as I joined the celebration. A toast to the self who kept climbing upward while chasing Edward. A toast to my divorced friend for escaping the sea of suffering. A toast to myself.